Have you ever dealt with a homeowners association that seemed to think it was running a small, heavily armed nation? One where the HOA president acts more like a tin pot dictator than a friendly neighborhood volunteer? Well, let me tell you about Bartholomew Thorne and his ridiculously named Oakwood Estate Security Patrol. They swaggered around our supposedly idyllic suburban enclave like they were an elite tactical unit, handing out citations for blades of grass that dared to grow a millimeter too long, or for children's laughter that exceeded some arbitrary decibel level only Thor himself seemed to perceive. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they could snatch my 8-year-old daughter, Lily, for the heinous crime of drawing a hopscotch court with sidewalk chalk. They really, truly believed they could get away with it. They just didn't know they'd poked a bear who, until very recently, had spent his days training Green Berets in the art of dismantling far more dangerous organizations than a jumped-up HOA. Where are you folks watching from today? I'd love to hear. And drop a comment below if you've ever had your own HOA horror story. I have a feeling mine might resonate with a few of you. My name is Mark Sanderson, and 6 months before Thorne's goons decided to play dress-up cop with my daughter, I'd hung up my instructor's uniform at Fort Bragg for the last time. My wife, Sarah, had passed nearly 2 years prior, a battle with cancer that was far crueler than any firefight I'd witnessed. Lily needed me, and I needed her. The quiet, tree-lined streets of Oakwood Estates, a good 3 states away from the nearest military base, had seemed like the perfect place to build a new, quieter life. A place where Lily could ride her bike without me worrying about anything more than a scraped knee, and where I could finally unpack boxes that had been sealed since Sarah's diagnosis. I wanted peace, a boring, predictable existence. I envisioned PDA meetings, not tactical briefings, barbecues, not MREs. I was just another dad, a little more weathered than some, perhaps with a stillness about me that some might mistake for aloofness, but mostly I just wanted to fade into the suburban wallpaper. My past, the skills honed over 2 decades in special forces and then teaching its elite, were meant to be just that, past. Or so I'd hoped. Bartholomew Thorne. The name itself sounded like something out of a bad Victorian novel. He was a man whose physical stature was inversely proportional to his ego. Short, balding, with a perpetual sneer etched onto his face. Thorne carried himself with the unwarranted confidence of a Roman emperor surveying his domain from the chipped concrete steps of the community clubhouse. He was HOA president, a position he'd apparently held for the better part of a decade, largely through a combination of procedural maneuvering, voter apathy, and the sheer unpleasantness of challenging him. His Oakwood Estate Security Patrol consisted of 3 overweight men in ill-fitting navy blue uniforms, adorned with cheap, shiny badges and utility belts groaning under the weight of oversized flashlights, walkie-talkies, and, inexplicably, multiple pairs of handcuffs. Their leader, a particularly odious specimen named Gus, who had the build of a badly stuffed sausage and the charm of a cornered badger, seemed to derive immense satisfaction from his perceived authority. The inciting incident, the spark that lit the fuse of my carefully suppressed past, happened on a Saturday afternoon. The sun was warm, a perfect early autumn day. I was in the garage, finally tackling a mountain of boxes, the scent of old cardboard and forgotten memories thick in the air. Lily was out front, her laughter echoing as she meticulously drew a vibrant hopscotch grid on our driveway with a new set of sidewalk chalk. It was an image of pure, unadulterated childhood innocence, an image that Thorne and his goons were about to shatter. I heard the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel at the end of our drive before I saw them. Gus and another of Thorne's uniformed buffoons, a younger one I didn't recognize, were standing over Lily. She looked up at them, her smile faltering, chalk still in her hand. "That's a violation of community aesthetic standards, little lady," Gus boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. Section 4, subsection B, paragraph 3. No temporary or permanent markings on driveways or walkways visible from the street, plus unapproved color palette. Lily's lower lip began to tremble. "It's just chalk, mister. It washes off. Rules are rules," the younger one parroted, puffing out his chest. He had a clipboard, naturally, the weapon of choice for the truly petty tyrant. I stepped out of the garage, wiping grease from my hands onto an old rag. Is there a problem here, gentlemen? I kept my voice even calm, the kind of calm that precedes a very significant storm, though they wouldn't know that. Gus turned, a smirk playing on his lips. Mr. Sanderson, yes, there's a problem. Your daughter is defacing community property. Defacing? With washable chalk? Are you serious? I thought. Aloud, I said, it's sidewalk chalk on my own driveway. It'll be gone with the next rain, or a hose, which I'm happy to apply later. That's not the point, Gus said, his eyes narrowing. The point is adherence to the established regulations. And frankly, her attitude when addressed was unsatisfactory. He glanced at Lily, who was now visibly trying not to cry. We'll be taking her down to the Community Standards Adjudication Office for processing. A cold dread, an emotion I hadn't felt with such intensity since my last deployment, washed over me. Taking her where? For chalk? You can't be serious. Deadly serious, Gus said, his hand moving towards the handcuffs on his belt. It was a theatrical gesture, but the intent behind it was chilling. Persistent non-compliance. President Thorne has authorized us to detain individuals for infractions that threaten the order and harmony of Oakwood Estates. She's 8 years old, I stated, my voice dropping a register. You're not detaining her anywhere. The younger guard, emboldened by Gus's bluster, took a step towards Lily. Come on, kid. Let's go. Don't make this difficult. That was it. The line. My carefully constructed wall of civilian normalcy crumbled. Before I consciously registered moving, I was between them and Lily. Not aggressively, not yet, but unequivocally. A barrier. Touch my daughter, I said, my voice quiet but carrying a weight that made both men pause, and you'll discover the true meaning of a persistent non-compliance problem. Gus, to his credit, or perhaps his stupidity, didn't immediately back down. He puffed himself up further. Are you threatening an officer of the Oakwood Estate Security Patrol, Sanderson? That's another violation. Obstruction. I'm stating a fact, I replied, my eyes locked on his. I wasn't seeing Gus, the HOA goon, anymore. I was seeing a threat, and threats needed to be neutralized. Observe, orient, decide, act. The ODA loop. My mind, rusty from disuse in this particular arena, clicked back online. Gus, overconfident, poor physical condition, relies on perceived authority. Younger guard, nervous, easily influenced, looking for approval. Neither had any actual training. Their stances were sloppy, their awareness non-existent. Before Gus could escalate further, Lily, bless her brave little heart, burst into tears. Daddy, I'm scared. That broke the standoff. Gus, perhaps realizing the optics of making a child hysterical over chalk, or maybe just sensing a shift in me he didn't understand but instinctively recoiled from, hesitated. Look, he blustered, we're going to report this. President Thorne will hear about this. You'll receive a formal summons. He jabbed a thick finger towards the chalk drawing. And get rid of that. Now. They turned and stomped off, their attempt at an authoritative retreat somewhat undermined by their waddling gaits. I knelt beside Lily, pulling her into a hug. She clung to me, sobbing. It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay. They're gone. They're just bullies, but even as I comforted her, a cold fury was solidifying within me. Bullies. Yes, but bullies with a manufactured authority who had just terrified my child and threatened to take her away. Over chalk drawings. This wasn't just about a ridiculous HOA rule anymore. This was about Thorne and his Keystone cops overstepping, abusing power, and directly threatening my family. My peace was shattered, but something else had awakened. A sense of purpose I hadn't felt since I traded my BDUs for dad jeans. Thorne wanted order and harmony. He was about to get a masterclass in controlled chaos. Later that afternoon, after Lily had calmed down with cartoons and a promise of ice cream, I found myself pacing the living room. The summons had arrived, hand-delivered by the younger guard, who practically threw it at the door and scurried away. It was an official-looking document, full of jargon and threats of escalating fines, liens on my property, and even, chillingly, Referral to external enforcement agencies for persistent non-adherence to community covenants. What external agencies? The Sidewalk Chalk Police. My initial shock had given way to a simmering rage, but now that rage was cooling, hardening into resolve. Thorne wasn't just a petty tyrant. He was a dangerous one if he thought he could operate with this level of impunity. He thinks he can take my daughter. The thought echoed, igniting a fresh spark of fury. No, absolutely not. I sat down at my desk, pulling out a laptop. My old training kicked in, the ingrained habits of information gathering and threat assessment. First, I needed to understand the terrain. I pulled up the Oakwood Estates HOA bylaws, a document so dense and convoluted it could have been penned by Kafka's angrier, more bureaucratic brother. I skimmed through sections on governance, enforcement, and the powers of the president. Thorne had certainly given himself a wide berth. The language was vague enough to allow for broad interpretation, and the penalties were severe. Then I started searching for Bartholomew Thorne himself. Public records, social media, local news archives. He was a small-time real estate developer who had hit a patch of bad luck a decade ago and had seemingly reinvented himself as the undisputed king of Oakwood Estates. There were a few old articles, puff pieces mostly about community initiatives he'd spearheaded, all painting him as a civic-minded leader. No obvious skeletons, but the arrogance was palpable even in print. His Oakwood Estate Security Patrol was his own creation, sanctioned by an HOA board that, according to the meeting minutes I managed to find online, seemed to rubber stamp everything he proposed. My internal monologue was a whirlwind. This isn't some banana republic. Thorne, you don't get to make up laws and enforce them with your private army of mall rejects. Taking a child? What in God's name were you thinking? Or were you thinking at all? The arrogance of it was staggering. He underestimated me. He underestimated every resident here. He saw us as sheep to be fleeced and controlled. He didn't see the wolf he'd just prodded. My skills, the ones I tried to pack away with my old gear, were stirring. Strategic thinking, psychological profiling, information operations, surveillance, counter-surveillance. It was like riding a bicycle, albeit a very lethal, highly specialized bicycle. I realized I hadn't just been an instructor, I'd been an architect of dismantling threats. Thorne was a threat, a different kind, perhaps, than the insurgents or hostile regimes I'd studied and taught others to overcome, but a threat nonetheless to the peace and safety of my family in this community. My first concrete step was a walk around the neighborhood the next morning, Sunday. Not a casual stroll, but a reconnaissance. I noted the placement of security cameras, mostly cheap, store-bought models, some not even properly aimed. I observed Thorne's patrol, making its rounds in a golf cart modified with flashing yellow lights. Their patrol patterns were predictable, sloppy. They spent more time at the community donut shop than actually patrolling. I noted which houses had "Beware of Dog" signs and which had meticulously manicured lawns, potential allies or Thorne loyalists. I made a mental map of the community center, Thorne's seat of power. It was a modest building, but he'd had an imposing fence erected around the back office area, complete with a gate that required a key card. Overkill for an HOA office. Were you hiding in there, Thorne? Or who were you trying to keep out? During my walk, I saw Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow from across the street, struggling with an overflowing recycling bin. I went over to help. "Oh, thank you, Mark," she said, her voice frail. "These new rules about sorting, it's all so complicated. And that Thorne, always sending his boys around if a lid isn't perfectly closed. He seems to run a tight ship," I said, probing gently. She snorted. "Tight ship? Or a pirate ship? He fined me $50 last month because my wind chimes were, and I quote, creating auditory pollution. They were a gift from my late husband." Her eyes welled up. Here was a fellow victim. "That's outrageous, Mrs. Henderson." "Tell me about it," she sighed. "But what can you do? He controls everything." Not for long, I thought. Not if I can help it. My conversation with Mrs. Henderson was illuminating. Others were afraid, resentful, but felt powerless. Thorne had cultivated an atmosphere of intimidation. This wasn't just about my daughter anymore. It was about a community held hostage by one man's ego. Later that day, I was looking through some old contacts, wondering if anyone I knew had expertise in HOA law when my doorbell rang. It was a man I recognized vaguely from a community newsletter photo. Arthur Jenkins, a retired police detective who lived a few streets over. He was tall, lean, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Sanderson?" "Arthur Jenkins. Mind if I come in for a moment?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Please." Arthur settled into an armchair, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on me. "I heard about what happened yesterday with your daughter and Gus." News travels fast in Oakwood Estates, apparently, especially when Gus is trying to save face after encountering someone who didn't immediately fold like a cheap suit. Arthur said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "I also heard you used to be in the service. Special Forces, wasn't it?" I tensed slightly. "I'm retired." "Good. Because what Thorne is doing here, it's not right. It's been escalating for years. This security patrol is a farce. They have no real authority, no more than any citizen. But people are scared. He's got them buffaloed with his legalese and his uniformed thugs." "Why are you telling me this, Mr. Jenkins?" "Call me Arthur. And I'm telling you because I've been trying to find a way to deal with Thorne for years. Legally, I've compiled a fair bit of information on his irregularities. Financial mismanagement, abuse of power, violations of state HOA statutes. But I'm one man, and he's very good at covering his tracks and intimidating anyone who speaks up." Arthur leaned forward. "You, on the other hand, you're different. You're not intimidated. And from what I gather, you might have a particular set of skills that could be useful in persuading Mr. Thorne to see the error of his ways." En alliance. Unexpected, but welcome. Arthur was the knowledgeable insider I needed. "What kind of irregularities are we talking about?" Arthur's smile widened. "Oh, the good kind. The kind that can get an HOA president removed, fined, and possibly even introduced to the inside of a real jail cell. Not just his glorified broom closet. He calls the Community Standards Adjudication Office. He mentioned exorbitant consulting fees paid to a company Thorne secretly owned, selective enforcement of rules to punish dissenters, and using HOA funds for personal luxuries. He'd even heard whispers of Thorne's goons confiscating items under bogus pretenses and those items never being seen again." "That office," I said, remembering the fenced-off area behind the community center, where he threatened to take Lily. Arthur nodded grimly. "He calls it the Discipline and Records Annex. It's basically his private little kingdom. Soundproofed, I hear. He's interviewed a few residents in there who got too vocal at meetings. They came out looking pale and decided to be much quieter afterward." "Soundproofed?" "For HOA business." A chill went down my spine. This was worse than I thought. Thorne wasn't just a bully. He was creating a miniature police state. "So," Arthur continued, "I have the legal ammunition, the knowledge of his weak spots. But I lack the direct approach capabilities. Thorne is insulated by his board, his patrol, and the fear he's instilled. We need to expose him, dismantle his little empire from the inside and out." "What do you propose?" I asked, my mind already racing, fitting Arthur's information into a developing strategic framework. "A two-pronged attack," Arthur said. "I'll prepare a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office, backed by my evidence. But that takes time. In the meantime, we need to neutralize his ability to intimidate. We need to show the community he's not untouchable. And we need to make sure he never, ever threatens a child again." His eyes met mine, and I saw a shared resolve. Over the next few days, Arthur and I became an unlikely team. He brought the legal acumen and insider knowledge. I brought a background in unconventional problem solving. We met discreetly, usually in my house after dark, poring over documents Arthur had managed to copy from the HOA office years ago, before Thorne locked everything down. We identified other residents who had been victimized by Thorne, people who had been unfairly fined, harassed, or had property damaged by Thorne's vague interpretations of the covenants. One was a young couple, the Garcias, who had been trying to get approval for a small backyard play set for their toddler. Thorne had denied it repeatedly, citing aesthetic concerns, while simultaneously approving a massive, garish fountain for one of his cronies on the board. Another was Mr. Henderson's son, David, a local journalist who had tried to write an expose on Thorne a few years back, but had been shut down by threats of lawsuits from the HOA's high-priced lawyer. A lawyer whose fees, Arthur discovered, were astronomically inflated and likely involved kickbacks to Thorne. We started to build a small, trusted network. Mrs. Henderson, surprisingly fierce once her initial fear was overcome, proved adept at quiet observation, noting the patrol's routines and Thorne's comings and goings. David Garcia, initially skeptical, saw the depth of our planning and the evidence Arthur had gathered, and his journalistic instincts reignited. He still had contacts at his old paper. Thorne, meanwhile, wasn't idle. He must have sensed something was amiss, or perhaps Gus's report about my defiance had truly angered him. I started receiving a flurry of violation notices. My lawn was allegedly uneven. A shingle on my roof was supposedly loose. It wasn't. My trash cans were put out 2 minutes too early. Each notice came with an escalating fine and a demand for immediate rectification. His security patrol began making more frequent, deliberate passes by my house, their golf carts slowing as they drove past, its occupants staring pointedly. It was a classic intimidation tactic. Crude, but potentially effective against someone less resolute. One evening, Thorne himself appeared at my doorstep. He was flanked by Gus and the other guard, a clear attempt at show of force. "Sanderson," Thorne began, his voice oozing false pleasantry. "Just wanted to have a friendly chat. It seems you're having some trouble adjusting to our community standards." "My only trouble, Thorne," I said, stepping onto the porch, making sure my larger frame was slightly more elevated than is on the steps, "is with bullies who get their kicks harassing children and senior citizens." Thorne's eyes narrowed. The veneer of civility vanished. "You new here, Sanderson. You don't understand how things work. I've built this community. I maintain its standards, its property values. People appreciate that. People who don't, well, they usually find Oakwood Estates isn't for them a thinly veiled threat." "Is that what you told the Garcias when you denied their child a playset? Or Mrs. Henderson, when you fined her for her wind chimes?" Thorne's face flushed a dull red. "Those were legitimate enforcement actions, based on the covenants you agreed to when you bought your house. Covenants that you seem to interpret rather creatively," I countered, "especially when it benefits you or your friends." Gus shifted, his hand instinctively going to his ridiculous handcuff pouch. I flicked my gaze to his hand, then back to his eyes, a silent warning that he, at least, seemed to register. He froze. "You're making a mistake, Sanderson," Thorne hissed. "A big one. I have resources. I have influence. You're just one man." "That's where you're wrong, Thorne," I said, my voice calm. "You've mistaken quiet for compliant for too long, and you're about to find out just how many one men and one women you've alienated." He stared at me for a long moment, perhaps finally sensing that he wasn't dealing with the average disgruntled homeowner. Then, with a curt nod to his goons, he turned and stalked off. The air crackled with unspoken animosity. The stakes had definitely been raised. He was rattled, but also more determined. This meant we had to accelerate our plan. Lily's safety was paramount, but I also knew Thorne was the type to lash out unpredictably when cornered. The Discipline and Records Annex, Thorne's private little interrogation room, became a focal point of my planning. Arthur confirmed that Thorne had indeed used it to counsel residents. The thought of Lily being dragged there, even for a moment, made my blood run cold. That annex had to be neutralized as a tool of intimidation. Permanently. Our plan had evolved into several distinct phases. Phase 1, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, mostly complete but ongoing. Phase 2, coalition building and evidence consolidation. Arthur and David Garcia were spearheading this, preparing a comprehensive dossier for the authorities and a condensed version for public dissemination. Phase 3, the direct action. This was my specialty. It wasn't about a frontal assault. It was about precision, psychological impact, and leveraging Thorne's own arrogance against him. He's holding an emergency community briefing on Saturday. Arthur informed me a few days after Thorne's visit. Attendance mandatory, according to the flyers his patrol is distributing. Subject, preserving community integrity and addressing internal threats. That's you, Mark. Perfect. I said, a grim smile touching my lips. A captive audience. And while Thorne is busy pontificating, his little fortress will be less guarded. The objective for the direct action phase was twofold. First, to discreetly access the annex, document whatever was inside, especially anything that could prove its misuse, and subtly disable its key card access system, replacing it with something Thorne couldn't immediately fix. This would symbolically and practically strip him of one of his primary tools of intimidation. Second, we needed to retrieve any confiscated property if possible, and ensure the place couldn't be used to unlawfully detain anyone ever again. I wasn't planning on planting anything, just exposing what was already there and making sure its sinister purpose was ended. The risk was that Thorne's paranoia was now heightened. He might have increased security or even laid a trap. I needed to be meticulous. I spent an evening with Lily, ostensibly helping her with a school project involving photography. We took pictures all around the community center from every conceivable public angle. She thought we were just having fun. I was studying entry points, camera blind spots, patrol routines for Gus and his crew when they were securing Thorne's sanctum. The keycard reader on the annex door was a standard commercial model. Bypassing it wouldn't be overly complex with the right, discrete tools. David Garcia, the journalist, had a contact at a local TV station who was hungry for a story about suburban corruption. If we could provide irrefutable proof, they were ready to run with it. The timing would be crucial. We wanted Thorne exposed publicly at the exact moment his power base was crumbling. The night before the emergency community briefing, I did a final silent reconnaissance of the community center. Dressed in dark clothing, moving through shadows with an ease that felt unnervingly familiar, I mapped the final approach. The fence around the annex was more of a deterrent than a real obstacle. The cameras were predictable. Gus usually sat in his golf cart near the main entrance during off hours, listening to talk radio, and, I suspected, dozing. Saturday arrived, bright and clear. Lily was with Mrs. Henderson, who had promised a day of baking cookies far away from the community center. I felt a pang of guilt for the stress this was undoubtedly causing my daughter, even indirectly, but the alternative, letting Thorne continue his reign of terror, was unacceptable. The community hall was packed. Thorne, puffed up like a bantam rooster, was at the podium, railing against elements seeking to undermine the fabric of our peaceful coexistence. He was clearly referring to me, though he hadn't used my name yet. His voice, amplified by the cheap PA system, dripped with self-importance. Gus and the other guard, Benny, stood like statues on either side of the stage, looking deeply uncomfortable in their roles as Praetorian guards. This was my window. I slipped out a side door, unnoticed in the general hubbub of latecomers finding seats. Arthur was inside, ready to ask pointed questions from the floor if Thorne's rant went on too long, providing a distraction. David Garcia was also present, his phone ready to record. Moving quickly and silently, I circled to the back of the community center, the annex. The air here felt colder. I disabled a poorly aimed security camera with a small, powerful laser pointer directed at its lens. A temporary overload, no permanent damage, but enough to blind it for a crucial few minutes. The fence gate lock was a simple latch with a standard padlock. A set of tension wrenches and picks made short work of it. Child's play, really. Thorne had relied on the illusion of security, not actual security. The keycard reader on the annex door was next. I had a small electronic device designed for exactly this purpose. It wouldn't open the door directly, but would allow me to clone the data from the last valid card swipe if I could access the reader's internal wiring, or, failing that, brute force common default codes. However, as I examined it closely, I noticed something Thorne's budget security installers had overlooked. The reader panel was slightly loose. A little pressure, and I could see the mounting screws. Unscrew exposed wires bypass. Simpler. Quieter. Inside, the annex was as chilling as Arthur had described. It was a small, windowless room, painted a drab gray. A single metal table and 2 chairs sat in the center, bolted to the floor. On one wall was a large whiteboard, covered in scrawled notes, names, addresses, alleged violations. My name was prominent, circled in red. There were also files, stacks of them, detailing every fine, every warning, every petty grievance Thorne had logged. And in a locked cabinet, the lock even flimsier than the one on the fence. I found them, a collection of confiscated items. Mrs. Henderson's wind chimes, a child scooter, a collection of garden gnomes, pathetic trophies of a petty tyrant. I took photos of everything with a small, high-resolution camera. The whiteboard, the files, the contents of the cabinet. Then, I set to work on the keycard reader's control box, located just inside the door. I didn't just want to disable it. I wanted to send a message. I rewired it so that only a specific, non-Thorne-issued card would work, a blank card I had prepared. Effectively, Thorne was now locked out of his own little torture chamber. My final act in the annex was to retrieve Mrs. Henderson's wind chimes. It felt symbolic. As I was about to leave, I heard footsteps outside. Heavy. Goose. He must have gotten bored or suspicious. My heart rate kicked up a notch. Complacency kills, Mark. I quickly resecured the key card reader panel, making it look untouched. There was no other exit. I pressed myself into the deepest shadow in the corner, behind a tall filing cabinet, controlling my breathing, every sense alert. Gus fumbled with his keys, then tried his key card. Denied. He grunted. Tried again. Denied. He swore under his breath, a string of colorful expletives. He jiggled the handle. Then, apparently frustrated, he radioed someone, his voice a low rumble. Yeah, it's Gus. Card reader on the annex is on the fritz. Call maintenance Mondays, tell him the president's going to be furious. He then stomped off, presumably back to his post by the stage, or perhaps to find a donut. I waited a full 5 minutes, listening before slipping out. I relocked the fence padlock, pocketed my tools, and melted back into the periphery of the community meeting just as Thorne was reaching the crescendo of his speech. And these individuals who spread dissent and falsehoods will be dealt with. Oakwood Estates has zero tolerance for troublemakers, he thundered, his face crimson. That was Arthur's cue. He stood up, his voice calm but carrying through the hall. President Thorne, a question, if I may. You speak of falsehoods. Could you perhaps clarify the HOA's expenditure on consulting fees to Thorne & Associates LLC over the past 5 years? And perhaps explain the purpose of the soundproofed discipline and records annex you've constructed? A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne looked momentarily stunned, like he'd been slapped. His eyes darted towards Gus and Benny, then to Arthur. That is confidential HOA business, Mr. Jenkins. And that room is for secure record storage. Secure record storage that residents are sometimes invited into for rather forceful discussions. David Garcia chimed in, his phone visibly recording. And what about the items confiscated by your security patrol, President Thorne? Items like Mrs. Henderson's wind chimes, which have a habit of disappearing permanently. Just then, as if on cue, the gentle, melodic sound of wind chimes echoed from the back of the hall. Mrs. Henderson, tears in her eyes, but a triumphant smile on her face, was holding them up. I had passed them to her discreetly on my way back in. The hall erupted. People started shouting questions, demanding answers. Thorne, for the first time since I'd encountered him, looked utterly flustered, his arrogance momentarily shattered by the unexpected, coordinated assault. His face went from red to a pasty white. This meeting is adjourned, he stammered, banging a non-existent gavel on the podium. Security, escort these agitators out. But Gus and Benny looked hesitant, confused. The mood in the room had shifted dramatically. The residents weren't scared anymore. They were angry. They were surrounding Arthur and David, not as accusers, but as supporters, adding their own stories of Thorne's abuses. This was the turning point. Thorne's carefully constructed facade of absolute control was cracking, fissures spreading rapidly through its foundation. He tried to retreat, to flee the stage, but the crowd surged forward, not menacingly, but with the undeniable force of a community that had finally found its voice. While the chaos unfolded in the community hall, a chaos carefully orchestrated to be one of questions and demands, not violence. David Garcia was already on the phone with his TV station contact. The photos I'd taken inside the annex, along with Arthur's meticulously documented financial irregularities, were being uploaded to a secure server. Thorne managed to push his way through the throng, Gus and Benny forming a reluctant, ineffective wedge, and disappeared into the main office area, presumably heading for his now inaccessible annex. I could only imagine his fury when he discovered his key card no longer worked. The immediate aftermath was swift. The TV station, smelling a major local scandal, had a reporter and camera crew at Oakwood Estates within the hour. Arthur, calm and articulate, laid out the case against Thorne, supported by a chorus of residents eager to share their own experiences. Mrs. Henderson gave a particularly moving interview, her voice trembling as she described the confiscation of her wind chimes and the fear Thorne had instilled. Lily's story, though I kept her identity shielded, was also mentioned. The idea of an 8-year-old being threatened with detention for sidewalk chalk resonated deeply. The legal hammer fell shortly thereafter. Arthur's complaint to the state attorney general, bolstered by the fresh evidence and public outcry, triggered an immediate investigation. Thorne's bank accounts, both personal and HOA-related, were frozen. His security patrol was officially disbanded by an emergency injunction, as they possessed no legal authority to act as law enforcement or private security without proper licensing, which, of course, they didn't have. Gus and Benny were last seen sheepishly removing their cheap badges. Thorne himself was formally charged within a week. Multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement of HOA funds, and even unlawful imprisonment related to his use of the annex. His arrogant bluster dissolved completely when faced with actual law enforcement officers, not the ones he paid to play dress-up. His enablers on the HOA board resigned en masse, desperate to distance themselves from the unfolding scandal. My vindication was quiet but profound. Lily was safe. The immediate threat was gone. I hadn't needed to fire a shot, throw a punch, or overtly use any of the more aggressive skills from my past. It had been a campaign of information, psychology, and strategic patience, leveraging Thorne's own weaknesses, his arrogance, his overconfidence, his sloppy operational security, against him. He'd underestimated a quiet, grieving father, never imagining the depths of experience that lay beneath the unassuming surface. The resolution phase was almost as intense as the confrontation, but in a different way. The Oakwood Estates HOA was in shambles, but it was a necessary destruction to allow for rebuilding. An interim board was appointed by the state, tasked with organizing new elections and reforming the bylaws. Arthur Jenkins, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to serve on this interim board, his integrity and knowledge proving invaluable. The community itself underwent a transformation. Fear was replaced by a sense of empowerment. Neighbors who had previously been too intimidated to speak were now actively involved in reshaping their community. The oppressive atmosphere lifted like a heavy fog burning off in the morning sun. Children played more freely. The ridiculous, nitpicking rules were systematically dismantled. For Lily and me, life began to settle into the peaceful rhythm I had originally sought. Lily, though shaken by her initial encounter with Gus, quickly bounced back, her resilience an incredible thing to witness. She saw her dad not just as a protector, but as someone who had stood up to a bully and won, not with fists, but with smarts and courage. It forged a new layer in our bond. She started drawing hopscotch on the driveway again, this time with an even more vibrant set of chalks, a small act of defiance and reclamation. I found a new sense of purpose, not in reliving my past, but in channeling its lessons into protecting my present. I didn't want to be an HOA president or a community enforcer. My contribution had been made, but I did attend the town hall meetings, offering quiet advice when asked, particularly on how to establish reasonable, community-focused guidelines that fostered safety without sacrificing freedom. My past skills were no longer a burden or a secret, but a part of who I was integrated into my life as a father and a member of this now healing community. Bartholomew Thorne's downfall was complete and public. He pleaded guilty to several lesser charges to avoid a lengthy trial. But the financial penalties were ruinous, and he was barred from ever serving on any HOA board or similar fiduciary position in the state again. He lost his house in Oakwood Estates to foreclosure, his name becoming a local byword for petty tyranny and corruption. The last I heard, he was working a low-level administrative job in another county, stripped of all power and prestige. A fitting end for a man whose ego had far outstripped his abilities. So, that's the story of how a set of sidewalk chalk drawings led to the downfall of a corrupt HOA president. Thorne got what was coming to him, the community got its peace back, and Lily got her dad back, fully present, perhaps more so than before. It just goes to show, sometimes the quietest neighbors, the ones you might overlook, have the loudest roars when pushed too far, especially when their children are threatened. Never underestimate anyone. The fight for justice doesn't always require explosions or dramatic takedowns. Sometimes, it's about careful planning, building alliances, and shining a very bright light into dark corners where bullies like to hide. True strength isn't about wielding power over others. It's about protecting the vulnerable and upholding what's right. And sometimes, it's about reminding those who abuse their little slivers of authority that their empires are often built on foundations of sand, ready to crumble at the first principled stand. Thank you for listening to my story. Remember to hit that like button if you enjoyed this, and consider subscribing for more tales. And always remember, your voice matters, especially when standing up against injustice, no matter how small it may seem at first.